So, good morning, and thank you for registering for Not All Were Welcome, Jewish Immigration and World War II. I'm Kate Kisselstein, the junior librarian in the Central Library's Local History and Genealogy Department. I'll give you a brief overview of some of the key occurrences in history that affected 20th century US immigration, then share a couple of case studies, one from just before the war started, and one that occurs after the war has ended, plus touch on some resources that can be used to help try and trace Jewish ancestors. Given some of the topics I will cover, do feel free to turn off your camera if you wish. Also note that all registrants will be receiving a link to the recorded talk later next week. And rest assured, there will be time for questions at the end. This first timeline is of events that led to changes in US immigration in the early 20th century that affected the ability of Jewish refugees to escape persecution in their home countries. One catalyst that led to the field of a pseudoscience called eugenics was Charles Darwin's publication of The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. As per biographer Janet Brown, with Descent, quote, Darwin set out evidence from numerous sources that humans are animals, showing continuity of physical and mental attributes, and presented sexual selection to explain impractical animal features such as the peacock's plumage, as well as human evolution of culture, differences between sexes, and physical and cultural racial classification, while emphasizing that humans are all one species. According to an editorial in Nature, although Charles Darwin opposed slavery and proposed that humans have a common ancestor, he did also advocate a hierarchy of races, with white people higher than others, end quote. In 1883, this led to English statistician Francis Galton to coin the term eugenics. Galton defined eugenics as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. He claimed that health and disease, as well as social and intellectual characteristics, were based upon heredity and the concept of race. Professed eugenicists worldwide believed that they could perfect human beings and eliminate so-called social ills through genetics and heredity. They believed that the use of methods such as involuntary sterilization, segregation, and social exclusion would rid society of individuals deemed by them to be unfit. The popularity of this pseudoscience would lead to the founding of the Immigration Restriction League in 1894 by 3 Harvard College graduates, Charles Warren, Robert de Courcy Ward, and Prescott Farnsworth Hall. They created the League in response to an increasing sense of invasion of the United States by, quote, undesirable immigrants, unquote. That threatened their sense of the American way of life. One target in particular were Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe who were fleeing the pogroms. The League pushed for laws to try and stem this tide. Their efforts to enforce a literacy test will succeed over 20 years later with the passage of the Immigration Act of 1917 by Congress. Before that act is passed, however, the United States Congressional Joint Immigration Commission, also known as the Dillingham Commission, is formed. Its purpose is to study the origins and consequences of recent immigration to the United States. The commission publishes its findings in 1911, concluding that immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in particular was a serious threat to American society and culture and should be greatly reduced in the future, as well as continued restrictions on immigration from China, Korea, and Japan. The Immigration Act of 1917, also known as the Barred Zone Act, for its creation of a barred zone that extended from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, created the main restriction of a literacy test intended to reduce European immigration into the US. It was passed by Congress on February 5th, 1917, overriding then President Woodrow Wilson's veto of December 1916. The end of World War I brought fears of the spread of radicalism, and Congress was pressured to introduce additional immigration restrictions. Based on recommendations of the Dillingham Commission, they passed the Emergency Quota Law, which imposed quotas on immigrants. The quotas were based on the immigrant's country of birth, calculated at 3% of the total number of foreign-born persons from that country, as recorded in the 1910 U.S. Federal Census. This quota system was enhanced by the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act on May 26, 1924. This act sought to make the quota system of the emergency quota law permanent. In order to further restrict numbers, this time the quota was set at 2% of the total number of foreign-born persons from that country, as recorded in the 1890 U.S. Federal Census. This effectively capped overall immigration at 150,000 people per year and barred any, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship, unquote. This most severely affected those immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, this discriminatory national origins quota would remain the primary principle of determining admissibility in the U.S. until 1965. Most notably, this highly restrictive quota system was in place during 1939, which leads me to our first case study. Our first case study revolves around the story of the voyage of the MS St. Louis. This image, courtesy of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, is of just some of the over 900 refugees who sailed on the MS Lewis in 1939. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, quote, on May 13, 1939, the German transatlantic liner St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany for Havana, Cuba. On the voyage, there were 937 passengers. Almost all were Jews fleeing from the Third Reich. The German annexation of Austria in March of 1938, the increase in personal assaults on Jews during the spring and summer, the nationwide Kristallnacht in November, and the subsequent seizure of Jewish-owned property had caused a flood of visa applications. The plight of German Jewish refugees persecuted at home and unwanted abroad is illustrated by the voyage of the St. Louis, end quote. 2 weeks after they set sail, the refugees arrive in the waters off the coast of Cuba, little knowing that the president of Cuba, Federico Laredo Bru, had canceled their landing permits and transit visas the week before. Only 29 are allowed entry, one of whom is only admitted for hospitalization after an attempted suicide. On departing from Cuban waters on June 2nd, the captain, Gustav Schroeder, turns the ship northward to head for Miami in the hopes that his passengers may find asylum in the U.S. Hardly any of the crew on board are aware that one of Schroeder's plans is to sail close enough to the port of Miami to run the ship aground. He believes this could allow his Jewish passengers a better chance of success at gaining asylum. While still en route, however, the U.S. Coast Guard is put on alert for potential attempts of either suicide or illegal entry. Cables are sent to Cuba and the U.S. with pleas for asylum, but in the U.S., the pleas basically come up against the quota system of the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. By 1939, the annual combined German-Austrian immigration quota was only 27,370 and was quickly filled. In fact, there was a waiting list of at least several years for any immigrants. The only response the passengers receive is a telegram from a State Department official which tells the refugees that they must, quote, await their turns on the waiting list and qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they may be admissible into the United States, end quote. Public opinion in the United States although ostensibly sympathetic to the plight of the refugees and critical of Hitler's policies, continues to favor immigration restrictions. As author Aaron Blakemore states, though Roosevelt had considered a concerted push to rescue Jewish refugees the year before the St. Louis sailed, he eventually dropped the idea, both because he knew it would be politically unpopular and because of his increasing focus on the looming World War. When the St. Louis is forced to turn around and return to Europe on June 6th, it is accompanied by a U.S. Coast Guard vessel on the lookout for desperate passengers who might jump off the ship. Early in the return voyage, the refugees also apply to land in Canada, but its prime minister refuses to consider the idea. The reason, according to Canadian Immigration Minister Frederick Blair, is simply this, quote, if these Jews were to find a home in Canada, they would be followed by other shiploads. The line must be drawn somewhere. The captain of the St. Louis opts to land in Antwerp, Belgium, rather than return to Germany, as by now the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which assisted with the Cuban negotiations, has made some headway in finding an alternate solution. The committee promises a cash guarantee for every refugee on board. As a result, 847 of the refugees find asylum. 181 go to Holland, 224 go to France, 228 go to Britain, and 214 stay in Belgium. The remaining passengers are forced to return to Germany. Roughly 3 months later, on September 1st, 1939, World War II will officially start with Hitler's invasion of Poland. By the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945, owing to Nazi Germany's occupation of some of the countries where the refugees had found asylum, 254 of the original 937 passengers, or 28%, have been killed in the Holocaust. One who did survive the concentration camps is Max Corman. He built on lessons learned on board the St. Louis to help organize inmates of the Westerbork concentration camp in the Netherlands. Blakemore goes on to state that, quote, after the Holocaust, the survivors of the St. Louis pushed for the remembrance of their ordeal. As a result, the United States changed its policy towards refugees in the wake of World War II and began accepting more refugees than any other country in the world, end quote. It is not until 2012, though, that the United States Department of State formally apologizes to the survivors of the ship. And in 2018, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau follows suit. Quote, but the memory of those who died is still a painful reminder of what a refusal to adjust immigration policies in light of persecution and migration crises can mean, end quote. As one of the survivors, Susan Schlager told a Miami Herald reporter in 1989, we were not wanted. We were abandoned by the world. From the plight of the St. Louis, I will switch to delve into events that affected the displaced persons after the end of World War II. As author Ruth Gruber states in her book, Exodus 1947, The Ship That Launched a Nation, quote, in the world outside the concentration camps, there were many who assumed that the survivors would rush out of the gates, breathe free air, and live happily ever after. Nothing was further from the truth, end quote. This image, courtesy of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, is a group portrait of children and adults at the Hebrew school in Le Gaberzee displaced persons camp. This timeline is of events affecting displaced persons after the war. On November 9, 1943, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, is created at a 44-nation conference at the White House. Its mission is to provide economic assistance to European nations after World War II and to repatriate and assist the refugees who will come under Allied control. But theirs is far from the only mission seeking to help Jews fleeing the Holocaust. In July of 1944, journalist Ruth Gruber is sent along on a secret mission to war-torn Italy to bring 1,000 refugees to safety. Their ultimate destination, the Fort Ontario Emergency Refugee Shelter, also known as Safe Haven, in Oswego, New York. While traveling there in a convoy, Ruth listens to the refugees' stories of courage, of terror, of hiding in tunnels, in sewers, in forests, of risking their lives to save others. This bonding with the refugees, she states, quote, became a defining moment of my life. I knew from then on that my life would be inextricably bound with refugees, with rescue and survival, end quote. UNRWA will assist in the repatriation of millions of refugees in 1945 and manage hundreds of displaced persons in camps in Germany, Italy, and Austria during that year. It provides health and welfare assistance to displaced persons, as well as vocational training and entertainment. It also administers the work of 23 separate voluntary welfare agencies, including the Joint Distribution Committee, the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training, and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. In late 1945, as the displaced persons camps are given greater autonomy, the voluntary agencies increasingly operate independently. UNRWA will continue to serve as a major employer of displaced persons until its massive relief efforts cause it to run out of funds. In late 1947, its tasks are taken over by a successor organization, the International Refugee Organization. The new agency inherits the care of 643,000 displaced persons in 1948. Even though World War II officially ends in Europe on May 8, 1945, the survivors of the Holocaust still face hardships. This is made evident after President Franklin D. Roosevelt appoints Earl Harrison, former Commissioner for Immigration and Naturalization, to act as the U.S. representative of the Intergovernmental Commission on Refugees. Harrison is tasked with examining the conditions of Holocaust survivors living in displaced persons camps in Europe in June of 1945. While approximately 7 million Jewish survivors had already been repatriated to their home countries by July of 1945, there were still hundreds of thousands living in displaced persons assembly centers. Some of these centers were established in former military installments, forced labor camps, and even concentration camps. Military authorities viewed these as temporary arrangements that would end with the repatriation of displaced persons. Harrison visits over 30 of the centers, focusing especially on Holocaust survivors, and releases his report on August 24th. The report offers scathing criticism of the survivors' treatment. Many are living under armed guard behind barbed wire, sometimes in the very camps where they had been victimized, in crowded and unsanitary accommodations that contrast markedly with the living conditions of the German population. The Jewish displaced persons, in particular, face restrictions on their movement. They cannot obtain information about their relatives, have nothing to occupy their time, and lack any representative to advocate for them with military authorities. Summing up the conditions faced by these displaced persons, Harrison writes, quote, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them," end quote. As a result of his report, President Truman writes to General Dwight D. Eisenhower and orders him to inspect the camps. Eisenhower, who has the authority to act in Europe, makes sweeping changes to improve conditions specifically for Jewish displaced persons. One change is that families are allowed to be housed together, and their food allotment is augmented from 2,200 to 2,500 calories per day per person. Another immediate result of Harrison's recommendations is the appointment of an advisor on Jewish affairs to the U.S. Army with the rank of Major General. based on recommendation of several Jewish organizations to the Secretary of War. Truman also asks Britain's Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, to allow 100,000 displaced persons entry into Palestine, which is under British rule. As Britain is in need of aid from America in order to rebuild after the war, Bevin is reluctant to say no. Nevertheless, he recommends the formation of a joint venture, the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry on Palestine. This committee, made up of judges, lawyers, historians, and editors, is tasked with analyzing the question of Palestine. Bevin promises Truman that Britain will accept the 12-person committee's decision, provided it is unanimous. One individual asked to serve as a foreign correspondent that travels with the group is the now New York Post journalist Ruth Gruber, mainly owing to her prior work with the refugees during the war. Meanwhile, part of the UNRWA's repatriation efforts are to try and help displaced persons return home, but these returns are not always welcome. One such example occurs in Kielce, Poland, where about 200 Jewish refugees try to return home. On July 1st of that year, a 9-year-old non-Jewish boy wanders away from home and stays away for 2 days. Upon his return, to try and avoid punishment, he tells his parents and later the police that he was kidnapped and held in the basement of the local Jewish committee building. That building shelters roughly 180 Jewish refugees. The police go to investigate, and the boy's story starts to unravel. There is no basement in the building, for example. However, a crowd of over 1,000 angry Poles has assembled outside, and soldiers order the people in the building to surrender any weapons and come out. According to an article by the U.S. Holocaust Museum, quote, after an unidentified individual fires a shot, officials and civilians fire upon the Jews inside the building, killing some of them. Outside, the angry crowd viciously beats Jews fleeing the shooting, or those that are driven onto the street by the attackers, killing some of them. By day's end, civilians, soldiers, and police have killed 42 Jews and injured 40 others. 2 non-Jewish Poles die as well, killed either by Jewish residents inside the building or more likely by fellow non-Jewish Poles for offering to aid the Jewish victims. End quote. The mass violence of the Kielce pogrom drew on an entrenched local history of anti-Semitism, especially false allegations accusing Jews of using the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes, with the intent of discouraging the return of Jewish Holocaust survivors to Poland. While the pogrom was not an isolated instance of anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland, the Kielce massacre convinced many Polish Jews that they had no future in Poland after the Holocaust and spurred them to flee the country. Coming just 1 year after the end of World War II, the massacre shocked people around the world. 3 days after the pogrom, surviving Jews and local residents bury the victims in a mass grave in the Jewish cemetery. Government authorities order military units and local residents to attend the funeral as a sign of respect for the victims. Although the government executes 9 of the attackers on July 14th, following a hasty judicial investigation, the Kielce pogrom sparks intense fear in an already traumatized post-war Polish Jewish community. From Kielce, Poland, we go to our other case study, which revolves around the story of the voyage of the Exodus 1947. This image, courtesy of the British Admiralty and Cornell Maritime Press, is of the SS Exodus, formerly the Baltimore Steam Packet Company's President Warfield, arriving with 4,515 Jewish refugees at Haifa on July 20th, 1947. British forces will board the ship and return the refugees to displaced persons camps in Germany, dramatizing the plight of Holocaust survivors attempting to enter Palestine. The Exodus 1947 was built in 1928 as the President Warfield and was initially a packet boat, but World War II would see her used by both British and American forces, most notably as one of the station ships off the coast of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Decommissioned in October of 1945, the ship was declared surplus. A little over a year later, in November 1946, the President Warfield would be purchased as scrap by the Potomac Shipwrecking Company. This company was acting for the Haganah Jewish Paramilitary Organization, and 2 days later, they sold her for $40,000 to the Weston Trading Company of New York, which was a Haganah Front organization. Zionist supporters in Baltimore funded her purchase. After retrofitting the ship to withstand attempts to board her, Haganah re-registered the President Warfield under the Honduran flag of convenience. She would leave from Baltimore for Marseille, France on February 25th, 1947, but she runs into bad weather off the coast of Virginia. The resulting damage requires extensive repairs, which keeps her from sailing to Europe for over 4 months. The President Warfield will ultimately land in Sète, France in early July. Very early on the morning of July 11th, the ship would depart Sète with 4,515 passengers, which is 4,000 more than she was originally built to hold, claiming to be bound for Istanbul. As all Aliyabet ships were renamed with Hebrew names designed to inspire and rally the Jews of Palestine, on July 17th, the President Warfield is renamed Exodus 1947, after the biblical Jewish exodus from Egypt to Canaan, and the refugees raise a flag with the Star of David. She is shadowed by Royal Navy ships, and each day during the voyage, the ship shadowing her comes within hailing distance of Exodus 1947, asking whether she's carrying any immigrants to Palestine. The Exodus always responds by playing one of Elgar's pomp and circumstance marches over the public address system. On July 18th, at roughly 2 a.m., about 20 nautical miles or 40 kilometers from the Palestinian coast, 2 Royal Navy destroyers come alongside Exodus 1947, one on either side, converge on her, and jam her between them. The destroyer HMS Childers strikes Exodus 1947's port side holing on her saloon deck above the waterline. Exodus 1947 releases her life rafts to fall onto the decks of the 2 destroyers. The destroyers drop gangways onto the ship and send a boarding party of 50 Royal Marines, armed with clubs and tear gas, onto the packet boat. Those aboard the Exodus, both passengers and Haganah members, resist the Marines, resulting in the death of 1 crew member and 2 passengers, plus injuries to another 156. By contrast, only 3 of the boarding party suffer minor injuries. Due to the high public profile of Exodus 1947, the British government decides to deport the refugees back to France. To do this, the Royal Navy brings the ship into Haifa, where her passengers are transferred to 3 larger and more seaworthy ships for deportation: the Empire Rival, Ocean Vigor, and Runnymede Park. Members of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine witness the transfer. The 3 ships leave Haifa on July 19th for Port de Boc near Marseille. The French government, however, states that will allow disembarkation of the passengers only if it is voluntary on their part. Haganah agents, both on board the ships and using launches with loudspeakers, encourage the passengers not to disembark. This leaves the British with the option of returning the passengers to Germany. Realizing that they are not bound for Cyprus, the refugees conduct a 24-day hunger strike and refuse to cooperate with the British authorities. Media coverage of this contest of wills puts pressure on Britain to find a solution. The matter is reported to the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine members who are deliberating in Geneva. For 3 weeks, the refugees on the ships hold firm in difficult conditions, rejecting offers of alternate destinations. Britain concludes that the only option is to send the Jews to camps in the British-controlled zone of post-war Germany. On September 7th, the three ships reach Hamburg, where the refugees are successfully disembarked. Relations between the British personnel on the ships and the passengers are afterwards said by the passengers to have been mostly amicable, as everyone realizes there would be trouble at the forced disembarkation, and some of the Jewish passengers even apologized in advance. A number are injured in confrontations with British troops that involves the use of batons and fire hoses. The passengers are sent back to displaced person camps in Amstau, which is near Lübeck in the north of Germany, and Poppendorf. Although most of the women and children disembark voluntarily, the men must be carried off by force. The would-be immigrants to Palestine are housed in Nissen huts and tents at Poppendorf and Amstau, but inclement weather makes the tents unsuitable. They are then moved in November of 1947 to Sangwarden near Wilhelmshaven and Emden. For many of the illegal immigrants, this is only a transit point, however. The Bericha movement manages to smuggle most of them into the US zone, from where they again attempt to enter Palestine. Most successfully reach Palestine by the time of the Israeli Declaration of Independence on May 14, 1948. Of the 4,500 would-be immigrants to Palestine, there are only 1,800 remaining in the two Exodus 1947 camps by April of 1948. Within a year, over half of the original Exodus 1947 passengers have made other attempts at immigrating to Palestine, which end in detention in Cyprus. Britain continues to hold the detainees of the Cyprus internment camps until it formally recognizes the State of Israel in January of 1949, when they are transferred to Israel. Given such changes and upheavals, you might wonder at how you can begin to trace a Jewish ancestor who lived during this time period. In addition to the usual genealogy sites, such as Ancestry, Family Search, and MyHeritage, there are some that are specific to Jewish ancestry. The following are a few that have records related to the Holocaust. JewishGen is, as they state, the global home for Jewish genealogy. They have millions of digitized records that you can search. One key database is their Holocaust database, a collection of databases containing information about Holocaust victims and survivors. It contains more than 3.79 million records from over 400 component datasets. As this is an ongoing project, they are currently welcoming additional volunteers. In addition to access to their databases, JewishGen offers online classes to help with your research. While you will need to sign up for an account to view search results, the accounts are free. The data available from Roots to Roots Foundation started being compiled roughly 25 years ago. Their database includes the combined archival holdings in Belarus, Lithuania, Moldova, Poland, and Ukraine, as well as selected archive holdings from archives in Russia, Latvia, and Romania. Also are included are documents from civil registration offices in Poland and civil registration offices in Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, Poland, Pinkasim collection of the V. Vernadsky Library in Kyiv, Ukraine, Regional Museum in Austria-Ukraine, and the private collection of Rabbi Moshe Leib Kolesnik in Ivano-Frankivsk, Ukraine. Lastly, Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, is in Jerusalem. Their website has a vast number of materials related to the Holocaust. In addition to survivors' testimonies, they have also been compiling the Book of Names. It commemorates the 4.8 million men, women, and children whose details have been gathered and uncovered over the years through pages of testimony, the location of various Holocaust-era documents, cooperation with memorial sites, and more. This ongoing project memorializes them in Yad Vashem's central database of Shoah victims' names. If you ever need any help, do reach out to us at Local History and Genealogy Department here at OCPL's Central Library. We're happy to answer any questions and provide guidance. Thank you.